Okay, let's get right into it. Today we're exploring a really provocative thesis from venture capitalist and political scientist Eric Lee. His core argument? That the Western model of globalization is failing, and that China is putting a completely different path forward on the table for the rest of the world.
So where do we start? Well, first, we've got to unpack the central problem that Eric Lee sees at the very heart of the last 30 years of globalization. He argues there's a massive, and I mean deeply consequential, contradiction at play.
And really, it all boils down to one simple but super powerful question. Both the United States and China created an incredible amount of wealth during this time. But if that's true, how on earth were the results for their average citizens so radically different? You have to ask, where did all that money go?
And here is where that contradiction just slaps you in the face. While America's GDP ballooned by 4 to 5 times, the median income for its citizens pretty much flatlined, or in some cases even went down. Now look at China. Its GDP grew by a factor of 10, and right alongside it, median income shot up by about 8 times. Two totally different stories.
Now, according to Lee, this isn't just some boring economic statistic. No, this is the spark that lit a political fire. He sees movements like the Yellow Vests in France and this rising tide of anti-elite anger across the West as a direct result of a globalization that, frankly, enriched a select few and left a lot of people behind.
Okay, so you're probably wondering, how did China manage to dodge this bullet? Well, Lee's answer gets into a really fundamental difference in philosophy, both political and economic. It really all comes down to a simple question: who's in charge, the state or the capital? And this brings us to a really key concept: socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now, what does that actually mean? Lei explains it as a system that says, hey, we'll use a market economy, that's fine, but, and this is the crucial part, capital is a tool that serves the state. It never, ever gets to be the boss.
So if you put these two systems side by side, the difference is crystal clear. In the Western model, Lee's argument is that big money, or capital, can literally steer the ship of state. It can shape a nation's destiny. But in China's model, capital is just a tool. A powerful one, for sure, but it's the political leadership that decides where the country is going.
And Liv puts an even finer point on it with this quote. He basically says that in America, the richest people have huge political sway. But in China, the 500 wealthiest people, they have zero influence on the political bureau. It's like a firewall, a total separation of private wealth from political power.
All right, so if that's the philosophy at home, how does that play out on the world stage? Well, that's where we get to what Lee calls China's new proposal for a different kind of globalization.
And here's what that proposal looks like, according to Lee. It's a globalization that's totally stripped of ideology. It's all about respecting that each country is sovereign, that there are many different ways to develop. It's about connecting with each other, but, and this is key, without trying to force your own values on everyone else. It's a globalization of pluralism.
And if you want to boil this whole operating principle down to one simple idea, it's this old Chinese saying. Lee says this is the #1 lesson China learned on its own incredible journey from a poor country to an economic powerhouse. And that simple idea, build a road, is the engine behind these massive projects you've heard about, like the Belt and Road Initiative. The whole concept is, look, we have all this extra cash and industrial power. Let's use it to build roads, ports, and digital networks in other countries. The goal, to boost interconnectivity and, hopefully, create shared prosperity.
But here's a fair question. Before you start exporting your model, you've got to ask, has it even worked at home? So Lee kind of gives us an internal report card for the last decade under Xi Jinping, measuring it against 3 huge crises the country was facing back around 2012.
So think back to about a decade ago. Lee says many outside observers thought the Chinese experiment was about to implode. Why? Because of 3 massive challenges: rampant official corruption, huge economic inequality, and terrible environmental pollution. But then, he argues, look what happened. You had an anti-corruption campaign he calls the most intense in 2,000 years. Then a poverty alleviation program that was just staggering in scale. And now the focus is shifting to common prosperity to tackle that wealth gap and a huge push to become a world leader in green tech. So in his view, they've made huge state-led progress on all 3 fronts.
And as a piece of evidence for this, Lee points to data from the Edelman Trust Barometer. You can see this really stark split over the last 10 years. While trust in institutions has been falling in the US, the data for China shows it's actually been on the rise.
And that poverty program we just mentioned, let's just pause on the number for a second. We're talking about nearly 100 million people lifted out of absolute poverty in a very short span of time. For Lee, this is the centerpiece of his argument.
He says an achievement on this scale is something humanity has literally never seen before.
Okay, so what about the future? Looking ahead, Lee has a pretty stark prediction. He thinks the failure of the old global order is shoving us all into a new era, one that's much more openly competitive.
Basically, his forecast is that this whole era of soft power, the idea that there's one set of liberal rules-based ways to do things, is over. And why? Because for a huge chunk of the world, it just didn't work. And what's taking its place, he says, is a return to good old-fashioned, hard power competition between the major players.
And in this new game, industrial power is king. Just look at this number. China's industrial capacity is now about a third of the entire world's total. That's more than the US, Japan, and Germany combined. That's the foundation of its economic muscle.
But, and this is a big but, there's a major challenge ahead. Even with all that industrial might, the gross margin, or basically the profit they make on what they produce, is still pretty low, around 12%. Compare that to the US at its peak, which was pulling in 35 to 40%. Making that leap in value and avoiding what economists call the middle income trap is the next big hurdle. And Lee's adamant, you can't just leave that to the free market. He says it has to be driven by the state, from the top down.
So, to wrap all this up, Lin borrows this great quote from Antonio Gramsci to describe this messy, in-between moment we're in, both for China and for the world. The old is dying, and the new cannot be born. It really paints a picture of a world in limbo, doesn't it? The old way of doing things is fading away, but the new one hasn't quite taken shape yet. And the big question Lin leaves us with is, what exactly is going to be born out of all this struggle?